Rules for retrogrades. Last week, according to LifeSite News' John Henry Weston, a bomb went off in the Catholic world, and that bomb was the former biographer of Benedict XVI accusing Francis of things that folks in the establishment Catholic world are not typically accustomed to accusing, which is specifically that Francis has essentially attempted to repudiate the entire Benedict XVI pontificate. He refers to something insinuatively, reform of the reform. And in turn, this biographer, whose name is Peter Seewald, denounces Francis' pontificate. Now, John Henry Weston did an episode on his show about it. He was joined by LifeSite's own Jim Hale and Andreas Walzer to discuss what he and they thought could be a watershed moment in the Francis pontificate. And the article on LifeSite was called, and you guys know I like LifeSite and I follow them for my news. It's called "The Huge Significance of Benedict's Biographer Denouncing Francis's Papacy." I'm going to tell you what I think the huge significance of the event is in a second. I'm also going to sort of report on the reporting as we go. So that's today's show. I have a bit of a different takeaway, and I think you'll find it useful in your approach to this train wreck, once in a church lifetime crisis of a pontificate called Pope Francis. As we now are in almost August, it's the 29th of July, and we are heading into the final month of summer, August. 2 months after that, we have the synod on synodality, where we expect the worst. It's an educated guess. Those of us in commentary are expecting the worst. Even the normiest commentators are expecting the worst. So in the context of what Peter Seewald, whose establishment as you get, the official biographer of the former Pope, Benedict XVI, when they're saying that the Francis pontificate essentially is leading the church into crisis, he said something as sweeping as, the European churches will be entirely destroyed by this. The European church is, contrary to what the wokesters in the Roman Catholic Church say, the heart of the church on earth. This is a really, really, really big deal, and I'm going to draw out one implication for you in just one moment that is a little different from John Henry Weston's reportage, which I'll also counter-report to you, tell you what he said, and then tell you what I think. First off, I want to tell all of you that the reason that I endorse realestateforlife.org is because I want you all in a safe place. I want you all in a red state, not a purple state, not a blue state. Get out of your purple or blue, get to the red today. Go to realestateforlife.org. Summer's the hottest time if you move yourself and you can't hire a mover, but it's the best time. People have vacation, and you can use vacation time for moving. They also are accustomed to making job transfers, switches in the summer. So go to realestateforlife.org and get, I suggest, to the blood red swath of states from Texas to Florida today. That's what I did. I went from the reddest, the bluest of the blue, the reddest of the red. realestateforlife.org. Please do, at the end of one month and the beginning of the other, whenever you're listening to this, consider supporting this show. The first way you do it is by liking and subscribing to this channel. Secondly, liking and subscribing to our Rumble channel, which has all the exact same content on it. Those are the first two ways. Perhaps most importantly, help us keep the lights on here. You do that through the locals link and the subscribe star link you see attached to this video. Fourthly, if you want to donate to me, the man with the webcam, which has become something of a bad cliche in the Roman Catholic world. I'm a guy, technically, a big family, 7 kids, a wife, just trying to make it happen, telling the truth day in and day out. I've been fired from jobs, been canceled from Patreon, been thrown out of family wills. So I'm a truth sayer. And if you want to support that, you can go to timothyjgordon.com and click donate. That's a little different from supporting the program through Locals or Subscribestar. We appreciate it however you choose to support this show. Support yourself by getting out of your blue state, get to a red state. Finally, we are still taking mail applications for www.return.us, RETVRN.us. We have tons of beautiful, virtuous virgins in the female applications, and we still are looking for male applications to match each of these virtuous young Catholic ladies with. We got way more female applicants than male applicants, which is the exact opposite of what all the trash talkers online said we would do. So it's kind of funny, as Niles Crane says, but we do need male applicants, and we are making matches on the weekly, and it's really, really exciting because that is a huge part of that one pillar of this channel's 4 pillars. If you need a review, 4 pillars: education, home educate your kids and don't go to college; patriarchy, there's a case for patriarchy, we make it; subsidiarity, that case is made in Catholic Republic; and right-wing community organizing, that case has been made in the self-titled second book pertaining to this channel. You guessed it, Rules for Retrogrades. Those are the 4 books that I sell, that I've written. Also pertaining to patriarchy is Steph's book, Ask Your Husband. They're the 4 pillars of this channel. They're what we do. They're what we use to substantiate counterclaims against those people that say, oh, Tim, you just talk smack on the Pope. No, I don't. But today there will be some Pope content, some papal, pontifical muckracking, if you want to call it that way. I don't even care. I don't even care to defend against the counterattacks by Pope-splainers at this point. We have Benedict XVI's establishment biographer, Peter Seewald, saying some staggering things. I'm going to read them to you, as reported by John Henry Weston in an article that was up 2 days ago and on his podcast, which Steph and I are supposed to join soon. The official biographer of late Pope Benedict XVI said some big-time stuff. John Henry Weston brought us. He accused Francis of being an authoritarian attempting to, quote, break out of Catholic tradition. That's a direct quote. And warned that Francis's recent appointments, most particularly the CDF, the DDF, whatever you prefer, Tucho Fernandez, who's going to become a cardinal in a month and a half, to be doctrinal chief. One of the most radical men on planet Earth is doctrinal chief, and the second most radical Catholic on planet Earth was Heiner Wilmer, who Francis flirted twice seriously with appointing around New Year's. It could lead, according to Seewald, to a flood that, quote, destroys the rest of the church in Europe. It's clever to speak this way, parish orphans and retrogrades, to say the church in Europe. The church in Europe means the church. It doesn't mean the divine commission of the church. It doesn't mean the great commission of the church. But Francis has taken it upon himself to destroy the great commission of the church, saying, don't spread the gospel. But the human aspect of church is being, as a matter of project, brought to a destruction point by Francis. And when you say the church in Europe, you mean, properly speaking, the church, qua human institution, okay? Now, here's before I get into what Weston said, and Weltzer said, and Hale said, let me tell you my big takeaway. Here's it. It's not quite as shocking or saber-rattling as some of my other conclusions about the 266th pontificate. This one's a bit more sober, but it's also sobering. Here it is. Francis, to the extent that he has a project, and the project is against the teleology of the church, he's apparently trying to bring down the church. Or at the very least, he's trying to subvert 2,000 years of church teaching. Let's put it in the most normie-friendly, Pope-splainer-friendly, establishment-friendly phraseology. He's attempting to reverse course in the church, which he'll all but admit to at this point. What he significantly risks, apart from whether or not he's risking the life of the church and the lives of all the churchmen and the lives of all the laymen and our eternal salvation, which doesn't seem that hyperbolic anymore. But let's keep it more basic. He's risking turning papal elections into the ecclesial equivalent of presidential elections. Once every cycle, in America it's once every 4 years, in some places it's 8, in some places it's 12, in some places it's 2. Everyone in the body politic, as we're preparing to do here in America, gets together and roots for a team as if it's the Super Bowl. This is my team, I'm 49ers, you're Broncos, we're going to clobber you. Like they did in the 1990 Super Bowl, which I remember oh so well. That's incredibly destructive in the Roman Catholic Church. Is the Pope, the most papabile candidate, going to be a Francisite? Or is he going to be a Benedictite? Or is he going to be someone that's, I would actually more full-throatedly root for than even the Benedictite, a true trad who really wants a reform of the reform, who really wants to take us back to true tradition, which Benedict so abjectly failed to do. You see how Francis, through having a putative project of unadulterated, unabashed, denuded leftism, is squinting toward that? I mean, before you had guys that post hoc could be appreciated, or maybe even during their pontificate, could be appreciated as, oh, he's more leftist. John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, even John Paul the 1st. A lot of people think he got killed or something for being a conservative. He wasn't. He was a center-left pope. John Paul II is complex. We won't even talk about him. Benedict XVI is a little bit right of center, not as right of center as a lot of you have wanted for decades to imagine. But that's one thing, to have Roman Catholic popes, and I'm not a fan of John the 23rd or Paul the 6th by any stretch, who are putatively Catholic, who by all measures of cognizability are still Roman Catholic popes. Yes, they will have a program that will be tangential to what represents the pure Platonic form of Catholic teaching in some way or another. I mean, not all of them can be Pius V, not all of them can be, any of the latter Gregories, not all of them can be Leo XIII or Pius X or Pius IX. One of my favorites that doesn't get his due credit is Pius IX. So, but people on the left would say, well, you guys like the enumerated popes just because they are appreciably right. No, what I'm saying is something a bit different. I'm saying even Paul VI, even John the 23rd, I think bad popes, they did not bring an anti-Catholic platform into the office. Set aside the more juicy, sexy topics of ecclesiology, of eschatology, that could reasonably be raised under the subheading of Pope Francis. I don't think it's too crazy to start talking anti-pope, to start talking eschatology, given what's going on in the world. I don't do it very often, but I do stand up for folks who do. I don't think it's as crazy as some of the normies. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying it's toxic to turn papal elections into presidential elections where you have half of the body politic rooting for and half of the body politic rooting against a given candidate, like we do once every 4 years, like we're getting ready to do in 2024. That's not healthy. And to all the people out there that purity spiral about left-right iconography in the church. You always hear people say, I hate saying left-right in the church. I never have. I never have. But if you people are more sensitive about left-right iconography, left-right imagery applied to ecclesiology than I am, and many of you are, then you ought to be hypersensitive with the ramifications of the Francis pontificate. Hypersensitive. It ought to be sore to the touch for you to think about the fact that Francis has brought with him in this 266th pontificate a full-throated expectation for the 267th and the 268th and the 269th that those papabile odds makers in Vegas who say, oh, is it going to be Cardinal Sarah? Is it going to be Cardinal Arinze? Is it going to be Cardinal, I don't know, take your pick. I'm forgetting the Filipino's name who, 2 or 3 years ago was considered most papabile. Someone will remind me in chat. That attendant to the mere probabilism of X, Y, or Z sweeping into the pontificate is a whole cheering section akin or identical to the cheering section of Americans who are cheering for a guy with a D next to their name or an R next to their name. So you see what I'm saying? It's a basic point. But Francis, because he's the first pope that had not a set of policies that he specially favored, which were Catholic, but rather an anti-Catholic agenda, which is now considered by the precedent example of Francis something that can happen again. That's how Catholicism works. Now you can be a full-throated anti-Catholic and say, the Great Commission is bupkis. We don't want, you're not allowed to spread the faith anymore. And all of the cardinals nearest to Francis are saying it. We don't want young people who aren't Catholic to become Catholic. Direct quote. I did a show on it like 10 days ago. Now that you have Francis saying, church teaching on sex morality is in its diapers, meaning it is going to change so appreciably as a baby does into an adult man. Babies become 6 times taller, 5 times taller than they were when they were born. They become hairier. They become shaped differently. Their face changes. They're not recognizable. Well, Francis has said, by use of that metaphor and by use of precedent, he's already changed sex teaching in a number of irreformable ways. He's saying that you will not recognize Catholic Church teaching on sexuality. Well, these two items are enough to substantiate the claim that now papal elections and papal conclaves have become as partisan, as ephemeral, as fleeting, and as seasonal as American presidential elections. And that portends only bad things. Okay, so let's see what John Henry Weston reports Peter Seewald is saying. And think about my takeaway principle in the background as you consider all this stuff. Seewald says that when Francis issued Traditionis Custodes, limiting the permissions of the Latin Mass made by Benedict in Summorum Pontificum, it was a, quote, stab in the heart for Benedict from which he never recovered. All right, this is his biographer. This isn't me saying it or John Henry Weston saying it or some politicized trad saying it, which is an implement of trivializing that normies and establishment Catholics have been using for the last 10 years. Oh, well, don't listen to what Tim Gordon says about the Pope. Don't listen to what John Henry Weston says about the Pope. Those guys are trads. So they're overdiagnosing the problem. No, this is the papal biographer from the last pontificate. The man who, through all his flaws, Benedict XVI, through all his failures of what we had hoped for, is probably the best pope since the council. That's a low bar. He's saying it's a stab in the heart that Benedict never recovered from, to have undergone the violent, sudden changes to the Latin Mass that Francis implemented in the last months of Benedict's life. He did not wait for Benedict to die. People will say this about some of the changes that Francis has made in the last 7 months, because Benedict died 7 months ago, to the day, tomorrow. 7 months ago tomorrow. He waited for some of this more radical stuff, but he didn't wait for the TLM, which was most dear to Benedict's heart. Francis is spiteful. So John Henry Weston was joined by LifeSite's own Jim Hale, Andreas Welzer, to discuss what could be, what he thinks is a watershed moment in the Francis pontificate. Now, this is very subjective. What's a watershed moment? I think the only major inflection point that counts as watershed moment, I know I'm stubborn on this talking point, but I think it's true, was the release in middle April of Amoris Laetitia, chapter 8, made the violent, irreformable change that everyone had said couldn't be made, all the normies, even though we had two antecedent synods. First, the extraordinary one in October 2014, then the ordinary one in October 2015, that said that this is what was coming. And everyone said synodality is being used by leftists who have swept into the cardinalate and into the pontificate in order to stage this kabuki theater. What we call it in cultural and political language is predictive programming. Predictive programming. We got that little stunt at the first synod in 2014, with the relatio, the midterm report. Remember that? It was super bad. I'm not going to say what it said because I'll get kicked off of YouTube. It was predictive programming. So the inflection point was Amoris Laetitia. You can't come back from it. People were slow to realize it. Those who are slow to realize it are more like it admit it. They're slow to admit it about Francis. They want to cite, to source the inflection point or the watershed moment, which is, I think, what Seewald is doing, later, closer to how radical Francis is being now, because it alleviates their own conscience. It alleviates their own predictive record. It alleviates their own track record. Whatever, I get it, but subjective though it may be, I make a strong case for Amoris Laetitia was the watershed moment. Welzer summarizes Seewald's remarks made in an interview for the German language website cath.net with a K, cath.net, stating that Seewald holds that Francis's pontificate is getting more and more radicalized as time passes. Linearly, yes, starting day one, I agree. And that Francis is attempting to destroy the legacy of his predecessor. Let's unpack this for just a moment. It's not a complex concept, but it is, like other simple concepts, capable of being misunderstood. If Francis is, as a matter of fact, attempting, as Seewald opines here, to destroy the legacy of Benedict, then this means already a proof text of my theory on the case, of my hailed danger. Pontifical elections are now as petty and partisan as presidential American elections. Why? Because that's what happens in these elections. From Barack O to Don T, not only is there a victory, but there's ressentiment. You know, Don T erasing what he can about Barack O. And same thing when you get Joe B erasing what he can about Don T. See how that works? There's not only the sort of politics of team sports, but you don't get the endorphin release and the kind of goodwill of slapping your opponent on the back and saying, hey, good game, the best man won, we're going to get you next year. That you get that endorphin release in sports, which is what's amazing about combat and simulated combat in sports. You don't get it in presidential elections. you apparently don't get it in pontifical elections either. Because Seewald, a very establishment guy, says that Francis has made it part of his goal setting, his teleology, not to be the best darn pope he can be, but in addition to being what we think is the worst pope imaginable, a kind of destruction pope, he's trying to thumb his thumb in Benedict's eyes. He actually said that his agenda is getting unveiled, Welzer noticed. He also said, well, this seems to be that Francis was planning this from the beginning to undermine tradition and church teaching. Now, I interact some with Andreas Welzer online. I was going to bring him on today, but I figured this is a lot of me opining. I think it's valuable opining, but everyone who opines does. So I just wanted to go solo. But this is a really good remark. I mean, there are pope-splainers out there, I won't name them, it's Michael Lofton, who say, well, you can't say that Francis was planning this from the beginning. You might be able to say what he did, though has Lofton ever admitted that Francis actually wrote Amoris Laetitia? Has he ever admitted that? And that Amoris Laetitia actually places the Eucharist in the mouths of unrepentant adulterers? That's a weird issue. There's so much in our divorce culture, with divorcees running around left and right, divorced Catholics running around left and right. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance about how evil this is, even among so-called faithful Catholics. It's really evil. Francis placed the Eucharist host into the mouths of unrepentant adulterers, which is a blasphemy. Okay? Divorce is the scourge of our civilization. And people are defensive about that. They're defensive of Francis about that, including Lofton. So I don't know why. I could take a guess or two, but it's not worth it. They're very defensive about what this means, what it does to the church, what it does to the Eucharist. But so let's assume, and I don't watch the show, but let's assume Lofton would admit, yes, this has actually happened de facto, ipso facto. But you can't say he was planning to do this from the beginning. Well, see, this is just what folks say who don't understand the way that motive is imputed evidentiarily to villains on the daily. You have, so every crime in the common law, going back to Magna Carta, English and American law, every crime requires the proof by prosecutors of two things. Guilty actus reus, a wrong act, grave matter, and culpable mens rea, a guilty, blameworthy mental state that set out to commit it. So it is the constructive, that means the people who are judging the villain at law, the jury and the judge and other legal parties, they construct mens rea and they say, we have to be able to judge you based on this. This comes from the common law. This comes from Magna Carta. This comes deeply from the Catholic tradition, which was signed by Catholics, Magna Carta. We impute motive all the time, and we say, particularly in crimes that are susceptible of having conspiracies, we say the conspiracy seems to have begun, it apparently began here. And the prosecutor builds a case, and the jury says that case was either made enough to meet the standard of persuasion or not. Either yes or no. We do it all the time. So this quote by Welzer, which I strongly agree with, this seems to be that Francis was planning this destruction from the beginning to undermine tradition and church teaching. It's altogether Catholic. It's part of the Catholic common law that we judge criminals on every day in the common law, which is very Catholic. Welzer also opined that the appointment of Fernandez as head of the DDF possibly counts as a watershed moment in Seewald's eyes, and that he is speaking out in a way that I think he hasn't spoke out before, in that stark and strong language. Yes, speaking out more is a kind of verification moment where one verifies, I agree that this is a watershed moment. It doesn't mean the watershed moment in the pontificate came that late. It just means it's a watershed moment for us who are readers of Seewald, because now we're seeing that Seewald is with those conspiracy theorists who believe Francis has formed this conspiracy to really, subvert the pontificate and the church. So it's only a watershed moment in that sense, according to me. Hale, who's also part of this show with Welzer and Weston, commented on the interview and emphasized that Seewald is not a fire-breathing conservative. Thank you, Hale. Good job. That's true. He's not. Let alone is Seewald a traditionalist. Thank you, Hale. Good job. He's a secular journalist. You cannot overestimate how significant this is, Hale told me, noting that Seewald in no way attacks Francis in his biography of Benedict. He doesn't. He's a secular journalist. What Seewald is doing right now, this is something that commands attention, Hale continued. This is serious, and I believe he's absolutely right. The appointment of Fernandez to basically the number 2 man at the Vatican is beyond disgrace. Welzer went on to point out that Seewald noted what appears to be a dig at both Benedict, who before his election in 2005 served as the CDF prefect under JP2, and at Cardinal Gerhard Muller in his letter to Fernandez appointing him as head of the DDF. Francis saying the dicastery had hitherto used immoral methods at a time when it pursued doctrinal errors, which is what the Holy Office is there for, the CDF, DDF, whatever you call it, Holy Office, rather than theoretical knowledge. That's a huge moment. Noting that Muller, Benedict, and Benedict's former secretary, Ganswein, appear in the interview, Welzer stated that Seewald is basically saying Francis is attacking them. So I think this is worth considering, that Francis not only is subverting the pontificate, he's not only subverting the church, he's not only, according to my thesis, turning pontifical elections into the petty equivalent of American presidential elections, but also he is doing these 3 things with a spike so as to thumb his nose at his enemies and take digs at them. Further, Welzer commented on Seewald's juxtaposition of Francis's public persona as a Pope of Mercy, a great point by Andreas Welzer, while really acting like an authoritarian and at the same time not preaching truth and charity to those who should be told to amend their lives. Welzer says, Seewald's remarks are very strong words of condemnation. Remember, the reason that these very strong words of condemnation by Welzer are so meaningful, this is the point of this 3-part interview. I agree with these 3 men, and I've said a little more, is because Seewald is not a fire-breathing conservative. So if you had the same expression of truth intoned by a conservative, would be that much more fire-breathing. Okay, and then the rest of it's kind of an attack on Francis, which comprises something I agree with, by Weston, Welzer, and Hale. But I think they're saying something slightly different, though consonant with what I'm saying. The huge significance of Benedict's biographer denouncing Francis's papacy is that he's such a moderate, and he's a secular moderate at that. And for his denunciation to have been so strongly worded implies that a truer, more Catholic, in this sense, more objective voice would make a denunciation even more strongly, and it would be even, like I said, it would be even more based in reality if it came from a Catholic, though this subverts the usual subjective-object split. When we're talking about Seewald, if he were a Catholic commentator, he would be actually more objective. I'm saying something kind of different. The huge significance of Benedict's biographer denouncing Francis's pontificate is that we are now primed to expect nothing other than, at this next conclave, which I think will come soon, American-styled elections, right? Super Bowl night on election night on Super Tuesday, rooting by one NCR for a far leftist, rooting by the other NCR for the moderate right-winger. There is no far rightist, right? But it's NCR versus NCR, National Catholic Reporter versus National Catholic Register, and all of their fellow travelers on either side, rooting for their respective papabile. Far leftist, Cardinal in the Francis mold, or center rightist in the Benedict XVI JP2 mold. And even though it was kind of that before, Francis is given the green light to really, really render even the more crass and the more unadorned, the more denuded version of this American political style process. I've never minded left-right iconography in the church. A lot of you guys say, I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. Well, that means you should be much more uncomfortable with what Francis has done to the expectations of the body politic. That is to say, he's made them think this is going to be a muckraking, stinky conclave election that we have coming up quite soon because Francis is old. I hope I'm wrong, like everything I report about Francis. God bless you, parish orphans and retrogrades. As well. Oh, you know what? Before I come out, I'll answer a super chat question. Noah, everyone stay close to the Mother God during this godless time. Here's the solution to these problems. You have a question.
Just a second. Yes, there's a question. That was Noah's super chat. Then the other super chat question was from Brian. And the question is, in terms of prophecy fulfilled regarding Fatima, La Salette, and Garabandal, do you see the synod in October being a huge milestone in ushering in grace being withdrawn throughout the world?
Too hard to say. I'm out of the prediction business in terms of Marian apparitions. I don't know what to make of Garabandal. Fatima is one of my deepest interests, but it's really just hard to say. It might be easier to answer that question, sorry to cop out, after Francis dies. A lot of things should be clear. But there's no way to answer your question, honestly, without a view to what are the cardinals going to do when Francis dies. Are they going to do the honest thing and say, we at least need to commission a subcommittee, however they do it, of investigators into the origins of this pontificate? Because that's what needs to happen. Even if that commission came back with, hey, it's a valid pontificate, I'd feel much, much better if they did that without the boss, the capo de tutti capi, looking over their shoulder. When Francis dies, they need to look into what he was doing. And as related to Fatima and Akita and La Salette and maybe Garabandal, we'll be able to actually get into the mechanics of what the more skeptical interpretation of those apparitions would mean for the pontificate, if we could actually have some fact-finding.
There's another super chat question, sorry.
Can you clarify the Our Lady of Good Success apparition that describes the papacy of Pius IX and two dogmas? Apparition was approved by a local bishop in 1611, but Pius revealed afterwards.
Do you want me to read it?
What did he reveal? This is really specific. What's the question?
You want me to read it?
I just read it. Yeah, I think I just read it.
Can you clarify Our Lady of Good Fortune's apparition that describes the papacy of Pius IX and the two dogmas?
And then what's the next word there?
Apparition was approved by the local bishop in 1611, but Pius IX's stuff revealed afterwards.
I don't know. Our Lady of Good Success, like La Salette, like Garabandal, has a part that is innocuous enough to be church approved and a part that is critical enough for the church to have suspended approval. When this happens with apparitions, We have to pause. It's fine to be interested by the implications of what it might mean if the second juicier part were true. And I confess to you all. But it doesn't mean that it's true. Just because there's a conceptual path where you could say, oh, the church won't ratify the portion that's juicier because it's critical of church, that could lend plausibility to the idea that the second part is true. It doesn't mean that it was. And none of us have the fact-finding to go and do it. So it's sorry. It's a kind of a hedgy answer, which I don't like to give. I have to give to both super chats because I don't have the information. And the more stuff, the more scandal that happens in trad circles, you know, as well as the Novus Ordo church, you know, the conciliar church, the more skeptical I get of everything and I back away a little bit. Because I am an evidentiary guy. When I'm up here making interesting claims, I'm making them with a lot of times a lot more receipts than I'm even producing in the video, because half the time I'm writing on it. And I have a lot more receipts. With the apparitions, it's just hard. They're so vague, they're so shrouded in mystery that they're really hard to be useful. Doesn't mean I'm not interested in them. It doesn't mean I haven't at times wanted to do lots and lots of shows on them. I just don't know how to make heads or tails of them. I'm being honest with you. And I know that's a little... That answer reflects a bit of exasperation. Exasperation with the trad side of the church over the last 6 to 9 months. I'm not going anywhere, of course. But I still hold all the same positions. I just don't know how to make heads or tails of Marian apparition. Akita, very interesting stuff. Bishop against bishop. Fatima, definitely we don't have the full third secret. See, I mean, I'm not backing off anywhere. But La Salette, Garabandal, I have my doubts. God bless you all. Keep the faith. Stay in the Roman Catholic Church. There's nowhere else to go off the bark of Peter. Don't slip off on the left side. But you people who are not in danger of that in my audience, parish orphans and retrogrades, don't slip off on the right side either. Just wait and see, wait and see, wait and see. And while you wait and see, pray. God bless you, Deus Vult.